All right, guys, we are covering chapter 17 today. Take out your note sheet. It says chapter 15, 16, and 17 review at the top. We are on number 35. So we're going to be talking about fossils and the history of life on Earth. So go ahead and get that out so that you can take notes as I go through the PowerPoint. All right, so the fossil record. Remember, we talked about Charles Darwin, and Darwin relied on fossils to tell him information about the past life on Earth, and he used it to show how different organisms changed over time, and that was part of his evidence for that evolution has actually occurred. Okay, so a scientist who studies fossils is called a paleontologist, and that's number 35 on your note sheet. And you'll usually find them out in the field digging for fossils, but you'll also find them in museums and stuff like that, um, providing the upkeep on fossils and looking at fossils to determine evolutionary history of those fossils. So what is a fossil? A fossil is a preserved trace or preserved remain of an organism, and fossils are usually formed in sedimentary rock. And you learn this stuff mostly in earth science, but under certain conditions, we can see how fossils are formed. Usually in a lake or sea, a dead organism gets buried by sediment that is deposited on top of the lake, and it basically preserves it um, so that it stays intact. Now, a lot of the fossil record shows that organisms have gone extinct, and an extinction is when organisms die out. So, number 37, when organisms die out, it's called extinction. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And let me go back. Number 38, fossils are usually formed in sedimentary rock. And number 36, preserved traces or remains of organisms are called a fossil. All right. There are two main ways that we determine the date or the age of a fossil. The simplest one that we have is called relative dating. And relative dating tells the age of a fossil with respect to another rock or a fossil. And basically, relative dating just relies on the sedimentation process, where the rock layers build upon each other. And so you have the older rock layers at the bottom and the younger rock layers at the top. And so the deeper a fossil is in the rock layer, the older the fossil. All right, and this has been an SOL question, so make sure you know how to find the oldest rocks and the younger ones. Now, a much more accurate way of determining the age of a fossil is to use radioactive dating, and radioactive dating relies on radioactive elements to tell the age of a fossil. So basically, radioactive elements are found in the rock layers around the fossil. And radioactive elements break down at a constant rate. And so we can use something called half-life to determine the age of a fossil based on the rate at which the radioactive elements break down. Okay. And so we actually tell the age of the sample based on the remaining radioactive material. So this one is number 39. Radioactive dating is the use of radioactive elements to age a fossil. All right. So this chart just compares the two. Relative dating can tell the age of a fossil with respect to another fossil that is older or younger than that fossil. It compares the fossil's depth and the position of the rock. It doesn't provide information about age in years. It just tells us the approximate age and the approximate time when period when it could be found. Whereas absolute dating tells the age of the fossil in years. and it's done in a lab. It is a difficult process. Now, for radioactive dating, we use several different radioactive isotopes. And carbon-14 is the most popular one, but it can only date fossils that are between 100 years old and 30,000 years old. Um, and carbon-14 has a half-life of about 5,730 years. So what that means is, um, in a rock layer, every 5,730 years, half of the carbon-14 from that rock breaks down. And so it'll break down every 5,730 years, another half will break down, and then another half. And so we'll end up with, so it goes from a half to a quarter to an eighth. All right, and so some questions that you might see on the SOL. This one asks you to determine which isotope would be the best if you're trying to find an artifact from around 3000 BC. All right, and so you have to figure out which date range that would be, and then look at the parent isotope. All right, and so for that one, we would be able to use carbon-14 because that's less than 50,000 years ago. All right, and so you might also see a question like this on the test with a graph, and it asks you about the half-life of, Californium 252. And so the half-life would be how long it takes to go from 100% of the element to 50% of the element. And so if you look at the chart, it starts to change right around 2.5 years, so 2.6 years. Okay. And if we ask like what are two half lives, then you would go from 100 to 50, and then from 50 to 25. Okay. And so that would be about 5 years. All right. Another type of question. Again, same deal with the last one. It says if the initial amount of mercury was 120 grams, okay, on January 1st, approximately how much would be left on June 30th, which is 6 months later. So for this one, there's a little bit more calculation. So first you have to figure out how many days is 6 months, because if you looked at the elapsed time, it's in days. And so in 6 months, there are 30 days in each month. So 30 times 6 is 180 days. Okay. So you would look for how much is left at 130 days, 180 days. Okay. And that would be 7.5%. Okay. And here's just a couple of other practice problems. All right. So, the fossil record tells us about the living things that have already lived. Um, Scientists also have studied how did life on Earth begin in the first place? And we have a couple of different competing theories: the Big Bang theory, and creationism theory, or divine creation. And I'm gonna get to that in a second. But you have to remember a few things that are like important to remember about Earth's early conditions. There wasn't any oxygen, so living things could not have survived from the very first moment that Earth was created, which was about 4.6 billion years ago. It took some time for oxygen to build up into the atmosphere or be converted into the atmosphere. Um, and so Earth's early atmosphere, it was rich in other gases like hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and water. But there was no oxygen. And Earth is estimated to be about 4.6 billion years old. So number 41, Earth's early atmosphere was missing oxygen. And then 42, Earth is thought to be 4.6 billion years old. Now, the Big Bang Theory states that all matter on Earth was created at one particular moment, and that was the land matter and the gases and stuff like that. Life was not created at that time. The divine creation says that there was some higher being that created Earth. This is not scientific. It's not something for us to study because we only study the natural world, and this is religious. Number 43. Why do scientists not study divine creation? Because scientists only study the natural world. Now, there were two scientists who set out to see if they could recreate the conditions of Earth's early atmosphere and see if they could produce life. Now, no one has ever produced life in the laboratory setting, but Stanley Miller and Harold Urey came as close as anyone has ever gotten by producing amino acids. And if you remember, amino acids are the monomers for proteins. Okay. And so what they did was they created this chamber, this apparatus that you see, that recreated Earth's early conditions. So they started off with water vapor because remember, it was so hot in Earth's early atmosphere because of the volcanic eruptions, with all the lava and the magma, that Earth really didn't stay, that Earth's water really didn't stay a liquid. It was more of a water vapor, or gas form. So they had water vapor, and then they had those gases. The gases, the hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, things like that. And then they added a spark, and that spark was simulating the lightning that would have also been prevalent in Earth's early atmosphere. And then at some point, Earth did cool down. They also have a cooling chamber. And what came out in the end when they finished their setup was the amino acids. And scientists now know that the amino acids eventually evolved into these proteinoid microspheres, which are bubbles that may form by some organic molecules. And then, after the proteinoid microspheres, we had the evolution of RNA and eventually to DNA. And then we got to living things. Now, the first living things were prokaryotes, and they had to be photosynthetic, meaning they were able to convert those gases in the early atmosphere into oxygen. And so that oxygen combined with iron, and so you had the oceans that rusted, the rust settled, it formed the iron ore, oceans turned blue, and then the oxygen was released into the air. Now, some bacteria were killed in this process, but others evolved. And those that evolved are our ancient prokaryotes that gave rise to all other living things. All right, so those bacteria that produced oxygen, they were called aerobic. They were anaerobic, sorry. And some of them engulfed in aerobic bacteria. And those aerobic bacteria then evolved into, our plants, our protists, our animals, and our fungi. And this evolution actually happened a couple of different times. Okay, so first they engulfed what now we have as our mitochondria. And then some of them also engulfed other smaller bacteria that we now know are as our chloroplasts. So those that engulfed chloroplasts became the plants and the plant-like protists. Those that only engulfed the mitochondria are our animals and non-plant-like protists. All right, and this brings us to our last topic, where the patterns. So once life started, there have been many large-scale patterns of evolution over time. One of them is extinction. Extinction is the disappearance of a species forever. And what scientists know is that 99% of our species that have ever lived are now extinct. And these mass extinctions have been caused by large volcanic eruptions, continental drifting and moving, and then sea level changes. We are currently in a mass extinction now that is driven by humans as well. All right. The second pattern of evolution is called divergent evolution. And divergent evolution is when a single species evolves into several different forms. And this is number 48 on your sheet. And Darwin's finches are an example of that. This is also called adaptation.